So I have why Scots voted no, or why Scotland voted no, or put another way, why 45% of Scots voted yes. Because I don't think it's so lopsided that we can ignore why people voted yes as well. So what I'm going to talk about today are the first findings, the preliminary findings from the Scottish referendum study that was funded through the Future of the UK and Scotland programme of the ESRC. The Scottish referendum study is a three-wave study, so we conducted a pre-referendum wave, a rolling cross-section in the last 4 weeks of the campaign. So we had 4 equal chunks of respondents that we looked at in week 1, 2, 3, and 4, right up until the day before the referendum. On the Monday after the referendum, we went back into the field to survey them all again, and we're still trying to drag the responses out of the last little group of them. And we're going to interview everyone again in March, 6 months after the referendum. We're interested in how losers' consent might change, but also in how the views of 16 and 17-year-olds might change, particularly those young people who were able to cast a ballot in the referendum, but not in the UK general election. So what I'll talk about today is who voted yes and who voted no, and I've got 3 main clusters of variables. The first is demographics. The second is kind of general attitudes that you might have, so how tolerant you are of risk, how you feel about uncertainty, what your level of national identity is, and then variables that are more related to the campaign itself. So what risks you perceived in the event of a yes vote or in the event of a no vote, how you feel about different constitutional options. So if you're thinking in terms of a funnel of causality, we're looking at the things that are kind of more removed from the vote and the things that would have been in people's minds in the last week. So in terms of demographics, the findings from the SRS confirm what we did in a previous risk study, but also what the polling has been showing us from before. Was there a gender gap? Yes, there was. Women were more likely to vote no than were men. Place of birth, as Don mentioned, place of birth matters. So if you were born in Scotland, you were more likely to vote yes. If you were born outside Scotland, well, it depends where you were born. If you were born in the rest of the UK, then you were significantly more likely to vote no. If you were born outside of the UK as a whole, you were more likely to vote no, but not to the same extent as if you were born in England or Northern Ireland or Wales. We also see patterns in terms of religion, with Church of Scotland attenders being more likely to vote no, but Catholic attenders being more likely to vote yes. So very much confirming what we know from previous findings. But let's look at age, because there's been a fair bit about age, particularly because the poll that was conducted by YouGov and released on referendum day itself had one conclusion about how young people voted, and the Ashcroft poll, which was conducted on referendum day and the day after, had a slightly different conclusion. So this is based on our sample of 4,000 people, and if we look at young people, that's everyone under 30, they were more likely to vote yes, and the most decisive group here is those over the age of 70, 69% of whom were more likely to vote no. So those over 70 and those born in the rest of the UK but outside of Scotland were the most lopsided in their levels of support. But of course, 16 to 29 is a fairly large age gap. If we break it down in terms of other age categories, we have 16 and 17-year-olds, those 18 to 24 and 24 to 29, we see markedly different findings. So we see that 16 and 17-year-olds were in fact more likely to vote no. So that's consistent with YouGov, but not consistent with the Ashcroft poll. But the Ashcroft poll only had 14 of them in their survey. And this is also consistent with some of the other research we've had from Jan Eichhorn, also funded under the Future of the UK and Scotland programme. 18 to 24-year-olds, about evens, I would say, as likely to vote yes as they were to vote no. But 25 to 29-year-olds, 60% of them were saying that they were going to vote yes. So that is as strong, almost as strong as those who were born outside of Scotland but in the rest of the UK, and those who are over the age of 70. So if we lump them all together, we get one perspective. If we disaggregate it a little bit, we get a bit more nuanced findings. Now, if we put all of those together and we look at the impact of age and gender and religion and where you were born, social housing, income, what do we know? Well, we know that they're all significant. If you're looking to the orange bars, those to the right of the zero, that's people who are more likely to vote yes. If you're looking to the left of zero, it's people who are more likely to vote no. So as you get older, you're more likely to vote no. If you're a woman, you're more likely to vote no. If you've got a higher level of income, you're more likely to vote no. So again, these are confirming very much what we've known before. But we're not just interested in demographics, we're interested in how people feel, and we're interested in how people feel about risk. And we have reason to believe that how tolerant you are of risk, how you feel about risk in general, might be related to whether you would vote yes or no. And we find that this is the case. We asked a very simple question. There's a long way you can ask this and a short way. And we just asked, how generally, how willing are you to take risks in your life? And we see that as you go from being not at all willing to take risks to very willing to take risks, the proportion of people who are saying that they're going to vote yes goes up. But what if we look at other elements? What if we look at risk aversion, risk tolerance, but also how you feel about the certainty of independence? How certain are you of the consequences of independence? What about your sense of national identity? If we add those in together, we find that risk on its own matters, but when you add other things, it ceases to matter. That's why it's in the kind of light-colored orange bar. Being certain about the consequences of independence and liking Alex Salmond make you more likely to vote yes, and national identity works in the intended direction. So if you're Scottish, not British, more likely to vote yes. If you describe yourself as British, not Scottish, more likely to vote no. Again, this is confirming what we have had before. But we also asked people how they felt about an independent Scotland and how they would feel about Scotland remaining within the UK. The top cluster here are the negative things. So, in the event of a yes vote, the economy is going to get worse. We're going to have a weaker voice. In the event of a no, there's going to be spending cuts. We're not going to get into Europe. We're going to have benefit cuts. The gap between rich and poor is going to get bigger. And then we have these positive things at the bottom. Well, if we're independent, we'll join the EU. We'll keep the pound. The rich gap will get smaller, and we'll be better off. And the general message here is that both groups are far more pessimistic about the alternative than they are optimistic about their own preferred option. So yes voters are more pessimistic about a no than they are optimistic about a yes, and the same is true of no voters. And if we look at more powers, we see because we have reason to question whether the claims about more powers or the arrival of more powers was decisive for voters. 60% of no voters thought that they were coming, and that was a good thing, whereas 10% of yes supporters felt the same. If we put all of these together, what do we find? So again, it's a similar pattern. So we're looking at, in the event of a no vote and in the event of a yes vote, what makes someone more likely to vote yes or more likely to vote no? And what we find is that the no side, those blue bars, the no side had fewer arguments that appealed to voters, but the ones they found tended to be effective. They tended to have more traction. So the message about the economy, the message about more powers, individually those are more persuasive than any single variable on the yes side. And the results for yes mirror what we knew before. If you're more likely to think that an independent Scotland would keep the currency or would join the EU, then you were more likely to vote yes. So let's look at the more powers figure. Does this suggest that the vow was influential in people's views? Well, if we were to evaluate the impact of that vow, we would look for two places. One, we would look to see whether people were convinced that more powers were going to arrive. And the second thing we would look at is whether that actually had an impact on how people were going to cast a ballot. So we can look at over the course of the 4 weeks of the campaign, and we see that more powers bar is the blue bar. People were, at the end of the campaign, more convinced that more powers were coming than they were at the 4-week point before the referendum, and that itself is a jump from when we asked people in June whether they thought more powers were coming. So by one measure, we might think, okay, well, maybe this was influential in how people voted. But the other way we would look to see whether it had an impact is whether it actually determines vote choice. And we can do that by comparing explanations for why people said they were going to vote the way they were voting in week 1, and then looking at how people said they were going to vote or why they were voting a particular way in week 4. And if more powers was more influential in week 4 than it was in week 1, we would conclude that the claim about more powers or the promise of more powers had an impact on the referendum. So if we're looking at week 1, we see, if we're putting in together demographics and general attitudes like national identity and what you expect in the event of a yes vote or a no vote, 3 things stand out for the no side. If you think the economy is going to get worse in the event of a yes, if you think more powers are coming, and if you're Presbyterian, in terms of a yes vote, So that's social housing, or certainty over the consequences, whether you think you're going to keep the pound and whether you think you're going to get into Europe. However, if we look at week 4, these are the darker bars, we can see the change between how we explain why people voted the way they did, if we asked them in week 1 or if we asked a different group in week 4. And what we find is that certain messages were more influential by week 4 and other messages were less influential. We see that some demographic variables were less important than they were before, so religion less important than it was in week 1, other variables more important. Age mattered more. Social housing mattered more. Gender mattered more. Certainty over the consequences of independence, however, mattered less. And the important thing for our perspective is if we look at the more powers bar, we see that by week 4 it was more important, but not substantially more important. If we thought that the vow mattered, if we thought that the promise of more powers mattered, we would expect to see a substantial jump in the ability of that variable to explain why people voted yes or why people voted no. And it increases a little bit, but it doesn't increase substantially. And instead what we find is that other arguments matter more. And the main message, I think, from this slide is that the argument that was made by the Yes campaign about what the gap between rich and poor would be like, whether it would get smaller under one condition or larger under another condition, had more traction with voters by the end of the campaign than it did by the start of the campaign. And the other thing is that the argument about the economy started to lose traction a little bit. So if you want to know what the referendum would look like had it been maybe one extra week, what we might have found is that the results would have been closer than if they were held on the 18th.